What if I told you that the most terrifying monster in Scottish history wasn't a myth, but a man? Not a dragon. Not a ghost. A real man who lived in a hidden cave by the sea, a place so choked with bones that the earth itself refused to bury them. His name was Alexander Sonnie Bean, and he led a clan that murdered and ate travelers for over 25 years. This isn't folklore. It's one of the darkest true crimes ever recorded in British history. And the truth is far more disturbing than any legend. To understand this nightmare, we have to return to a Scotland that no longer exists, a land not of kings and castles, but of famine, superstition, and brutal, uneven justice. The people lived under crushing taxes and constant fear. Hunger ruled the villages. Trust was a luxury. Justice came quickly and without mercy. It was into this chaos that Alexander Bean was born. Not as a monster, not yet. But as a boy in a world that offered him nothing, except a shovel, a trench, and a lifetime of servitude. Alexander Sonnie Bean was born into hardship. His father was a laborer, stooped, worn down, and broken by a lifetime of digging trenches for men who would never learn his name. From an early age, Sonnie saw labor not as honor, but as humiliation. He swore he would never die with a shovel in his hand. At 16, he ran. He stole a horse and vanished into the Scottish hills, a fugitive from the life he was born into. He tried odd jobs, a tanner's apprentice, a fisherman, but he was quickly fired for stealing. Robbery became routine. His name hovered near the gallows. And then, he met her. Agnes Douglas. Red-haired. Sharp-tongued. Burned and banished from village after village for whispering strange things to children and gathering herbs the church didn't like. They called her a witch. She called herself something else, the Reckoner. Agnes wasn't afraid of Sonnie. She admired him. And more importantly, she had ideas of her own. They didn't flee society out of fear. They rejected it. Together, they vanished, not into exile, but into rebellion. They chose to live outside the rules of man. And it was that choice that lit the first spark of horror. Somewhere along the desolate southwestern coast of Scotland, Sonnie and Agnes found what they had been unknowingly searching for, a narrow inlet hidden behind jagged black stone, invisible at high tide, whispered about by fishermen but never explored. Locals believed it was cursed. They said no birds flew near it, that the waves that crashed against its mouth sounded different, like breathing. And they were right to fear it. Because when the tide receded, that inlet opened into a yawning cavern, immense, dry, untouched by man. No map had ever marked it. No law ever reached it. For Sonnie and Agnes, it was not just shelter. It was freedom. It was defiance made physical. They built no house, no hearth, left no trace above ground. Everything they owned, they carried into that hole in the earth. Agnes brought with her dried roots, stolen meat, scraps of iron, and a battered cooking pot. Sonnie brought his knife, his stolen goods, and a hatred that had only deepened with time. Together, they weren't just hiding, they were seeding something. Something feral. Something that would grow teeth. The first winter nearly killed them. Winds screamed through the cave like the voices of the damned. Rain seeped in through stone cracks. They slept on mud and bone and each other. But they survived. Barely. And when spring came, so did something else. Agnes was pregnant. In that cold blackness, lit only by stolen candles, she gave birth alone. The child was not named after a saint. There were no saints in that cave. There was no God. Only the child, the cold, and the instinct to survive. His cries echoed against the stone and faded into the endless dark. That was the moment the Bean clan was born. More children followed. No midwives. No church bells. No records. Only mouths to feed and silence to maintain. Agnes became midwife, teacher, and butcher. Sonnie became hunter, killer, and protector. Their children were not taught scripture or history. They were taught how to listen for footsteps in the night. How to stay still when the wind changed. How to obey without question. And when they were old enough, how to kill. Sonnie would leave the cave under the cover of darkness, stalking the cliffside roads for lone travelers, merchants, pilgrims, wanderers. His methods became more precise with each kill. A knife to the spine. A rope snare. Later, steel traps and tripwires. He learned how to get a man in seconds. Agnes learned how to preserve flesh using salt and ash. The children watched. And then they imitated. Soon, the whole family took part. When they killed, they took everything. Rings. Boots. Teeth. Flesh was eaten. Bones were burned, crushed, or turned into tools and toys. Belongings were dumped into the sea. At first, they told themselves it was justice. The world had exiled them, scorned them, hunted them like animals. Now they were only taking what they were owed. But that self-righteous anger soon curdled into something far more dangerous. It stopped being about revenge. It became about appetite. Hunger became ritual. Killing became inheritance. The cave became its own universe. Above ground, time moved with the sun. Below, time dissolved into cycles of blood and hunger. The walls grew darker. The silence thicker. The air smelled of copper and wet stone. And in that dark cradle of salt and death, a new kind of family took root. A family untouched by light. Unbound by law. Unafraid of man. A family that would grow into legend, then nightmare. A clan born not from evil, but from abandonment. And by the time the world above realized what it had left to rot beneath the cliffs, it was already too late. As the years dragged on in eternal darkness, the children of Sonnie and Agnes grew, not just in number, but in nature. They were not raised to be human as the world above knew it. They were born in silence and taught to fear the sun, trained from infancy not in words but in glances, not in scripture but in the rhythm of breath before a kill. There were no lullabies, only the sound of knives against bone, the crackle of boiling meat, the scraping of fingernails on cave walls. As they reached adolescence, they turned inward, not just as a family, but as flesh. Brothers lay with sisters. Cousins became lovers. Bloodlines looped and curled into each other like roots tangled beneath the forest floor. No names. No marriage. No concept of sin. Love was never spoken. Lust was never hidden. What mattered wasn't who belonged to whom, but who could survive the cold, the hunger, and the killing. And survive they did. The cave no longer echoed with screams of prey, but with new cries, births that led to more mouths, more hunters, more darkness. Time lost all meaning inside that place. Without sunlight, the days became nothing but cycles: hunt, kill, feast, rest, repeat. They developed rituals, silent feasts after successful ambushes, skulls stacked in spirals along the cave floor, lullabies hummed in sounds not even language could translate. The children were not given names in any traditional sense. Some were called after the sounds they made when they first crawled. Moth. Gurg. Tarn. Their language, if it could be called that, regressed into something guttural and primal. They communicated with gestures, breath, touch, and violence. The older children became teachers, guiding the younger in the art of ambush and anatomy. A new child, upon reaching a certain age, perhaps 6, perhaps 10, no one counted, would be expected to make their first kill in front of the entire family. It was a rite, a blood baptism. If the child hesitated, if they cried, if they showed mercy, they were not punished, they were devoured. Weakness had no place in the cave. Some children did resist. A girl with softer eyes once tried to hide a wounded traveler. A boy refused to eat the meat after his first kill. Both were gone by morning. In their place, silence, and the next child waiting their turn. Sonnie and Agnes, now twisted into parental gods, presided over it all like monarchs of madness. Sonnie ruled with violence, teaching his sons to get a man faster than they could tie a knot. Agnes, older now and thinner, etched strange symbols into the rock with charcoal and blood, whispering to things no one else could hear. She claimed the cave spoke back. She claimed it had memory. The cave itself began to reflect their growing monstrosity. Walls were decorated with bones arranged by size, shape, meaning, children's toys made from knuckles and teeth, hooks carved from driftwood and rib bone hung from the ceiling like chandeliers. One chamber was used only for curing flesh, the air inside thick with rot and copper and something worse, normalcy. To the clan, it was not horror. It was life. This was not a secret anymore. It was their identity, their mythology, their legacy being born in real time, dripping, screaming, growing sharper with every generation. And while the world above dismissed the vanishing travelers as victims of wolves or pirates or the wrath of the gods, down in the belly of the cliffs, a new kind of creature was being formed, one that no longer remembered light, or warmth, or empathy. They were not animals. They were not men. They were something new, something bred by darkness, shaped by hunger, and forged in silence. As the clan multiplied within the bowels of the earth, so too did their hunger. No longer satisfied with the rare traveler who wandered too close to the cliffs, the Bean clan turned outward, expanding their reach like a cancer into the arteries of Scotland's forgotten coasts. They began to stalk not just lone pilgrims but entire families. Wagons. Trading caravans. A shepherd with his flock. A bride en route to her wedding. Their methods evolved. What began as crude ambushes turned into calculated operations. They learned to track footprints through dew-wet grass, to follow the scent of fire smoke on the wind. They understood the pulse of the roads, when travelers moved, when guards changed shift, when horses grew tired. They became hunters not just of flesh, but of patterns, of timing, of fear. And when they struck, they made sure the message was clear. Limbs left hanging from branches. Skulls arranged in rings in the middle of roads. Torsos nailed to tree trunks, emptied and grinning like hollow jackals. These were no longer simply killings, they were exhibitions. Art made from agony. To the Bean clan, it was declaration. Territory. Proof that the world above would never escape what it chose to ignore. And yet, no one truly understood what was happening. Villagers whispered of disappearances but never connected the dots. The roads were blamed. Maybe wolves. Maybe pirates from the Irish coast. Some said it was punishment from God. Others said the old gods had returned. None dared imagine that the threat came not from the sea or the sky, but from beneath their own soil. Even when a merchant caravan vanished without a trace, when fishermen pulled bones tangled in their nets, when a bard's harp was found shattered and bloodstained near a trailhead, the rumors remained just that, rumors. The king's men came and went, asked questions, wrote reports, found nothing. How could they? Who would think to look for evil behind stone and tide? And all the while, the cave transformed. It was no longer just shelter, it became an ecosystem of horror. Chambers were designated for different purposes: slaughter, preservation, ritual. The walls pulsed with the memory of screams. Skulls were stacked like books, sorted by size and story. A narrow hole known only as the spiral was lined with jawbones. In one chamber, Agnes, now sunken-eyed, her voice barely a breath, carved symbols into the rock with a mixture of serp and marrow. She no longer spoke to the children. She spoke to the cave. And it, she claimed, had begun to speak back. Meanwhile, the children played beneath corpses hung to dry, swinging between the legs of the dead like it was a game. And to them, it was. Death wasn't horror. It was inheritance. It was continuity. It was love in its most primal form. But outside, in the world that had almost forgotten them, the air had begun to change. A mother found her son's shoe half buried in the sand, stained with something that wasn't quite mud. She didn't scream, she just sat by the cliffs and sang his lullaby to the wind. A shepherd swore he saw a man sniffing the ground like a dog. A child was found naked outside the village gate, feral, teeth filed to points. He vanished before dawn. Still, no one acted. Because fear has a way of reshaping truth into convenience. It was easier to blame the woods, the waves, or the wrath of heaven than to face the reality that a different kind of people now lived beneath the earth. Not ghosts. Not beasts. But something that used to be human, something that remembered pain, inherited rage, and consumed everything the world discarded. And they were still hungry. Time passed, but inside the cave, there were no seasons, no calendars, only the slow erosion of flesh, the quiet warping of bloodlines, and the inevitable decay of even the strongest tyrant. Sonnie Bean, once a hunter as sharp and cold as the knife he carried, began to wither. His hair thinned, his joints curled into claws from years of carving bone. His eyes dimmed, not with weakness, but with memory. And memory, in that cave, was a dangerous thing. The clan had grown far beyond what he and Agnes ever imagined. Dozens of children, now adults, their children breeding still more. A generation born of silence and marrow now pressed at the cave walls like overgrown roots. Among them, one voice began to rise louder than the others. Bram. The firstborn. Taller than Sonnie had ever been. Quicker with a blade. Slower to kneel. His face was carved from the same rage, but refined by time, by practice, by inherited cruelty. Bran did not grunt like his siblings. He spoke. He questioned. He demanded. Why hide like worms when they could rise like wolves? Why eat in the dark when they could feast in the open? Why be legend when they could be gods? Sonnie dismissed it at first, viewed Bram's defiance as strength, not wrath. But Agnes, now so frail her breath rattled like dried leaves, whispered to him from the shadows, "Your children are no longer yours." And she was right. The old blood, those raised by Sonnie and Agnes, still clung to the code of shadows, kill silently, vanish without trace, leave no flame behind. But the newer generation, born without memory of rejection, without knowledge of the world above, hungered for more than flesh. They hungered for spectacle. They wanted to raid villages, burn churches, drag entire communities into the cave and rebuild the world in their own image. Ritual gave way to chaos. Control began to slip. Sonnie issued commands, but his voice no longer silenced the cavern. When he spoke, the younger ones listened, and then turned to Bram. And Bram smiled. Because he had been waiting. He called a gathering in the Red Hall, a vast chamber lined with ribs, both cattle and human, where the ceiling dripped with condensation and the ground was stained with generations of blood. There, standing beneath a chandelier of vertebrae, Bram declared a new era. No more hiding. No more waiting. The time had come to expand inland, to claim the forests, to make the villages kneel or disappear. Some would be taken. Some would be eaten. All would know the name Bean. Sonnie stood, shaking, his hands curdled like claws, and spoke against him. For a moment, silence fell. And then Bram laughed. No one stood beside the old man. Not even his daughters. Not even the sons who had once buried their faces in his chest to sleep. Agnes watched from the shadows, muttering to herself, drawing circles with a broken tooth dipped in certain blood. She no longer belonged to the clan. She belonged to the cave. That very night, Bram's loyalists staged their first raid under his command. They stormed the hilltop farm, slaughtered livestock, burned the barn to black ash, and left a message smeared in blood across the chapel door: "The flesh below has risen." It was not just a warning, it was a declaration of war. And it worked. The kingdom stirred. Rumors flared like torches. A cult. A pagan uprising. Demons in human skin. While religious leaders called for prayer, the king's advisors began to whisper of something far more dangerous than folklore. And yet, still, no one knew where to look. Because the true evil wasn't in the fire or the screams. It was still hidden, just beneath the stone, smiling with sharpened teeth, and learning how to lead. The morning after Bram's declaration, the Bean clan crossed a line they could never return from. No longer content with secrecy or whispers in the fog, they emerged from the cliffside like a plague with purpose. A raiding party of young men, clad in stitched bone and wrapped in flayed skin, descended upon a quiet village at the edge of the moor. They carried torches made from thigh bones, their faces smeared with ash and dried blood. We did not hunt. They invaded. Barns were set ablaze. Animals were torn open and hung from fences as grotesque decorations. A shepherd's wife was nailed to a stable door. A priest was found with his tongue removed and eyes replaced with pebbles. And on the chapel wall, written in thick, clotted blood, the flesh below has risen. This time, no one could pretend it was wolves. No bandits left messages in Latin. No pirates skinned cattle in spirals. Panic swept through the lowlands like wildfire. Villages emptied. Trade routes were rerouted overnight. Children were kept indoors even in daylight. Farmers abandoned their fields. Superstition curdled into paranoia. Still, no one could name the threat. The king's envoys were sent to investigate. Witnesses gave stories that sounded like madness: humanoid figures crawling on all fours, teeth filed into points, women with hollow eyes and runes carved into their bellies. Cartographers were summoned. Maps were redrawn. Eyes turned to the sea. For the first time in decades, the legend of a cannibal clan was no longer a drunken tale around a hearth. It was a question of national security. Inside the cave, the energy shifted again. Tension rippled through the tunnels like a fever. Food grew scarce. Too many mouths, too little meat. The young no longer waited for portions, they took what they wanted. Bones meant for ritual were stolen, chewed, discarded. Arguments turned to bloodshed. In a fight over a marrow bone, one child crushed his cousin's skull with a rock. Another chamber collapsed during a brawl, burying 3 siblings alive. The cave, once their sanctuary, now groaned under the weight of their violence, like even the stone had grown tired of them. Sonnie wandered like a ghost, a relic from a fading age, talking to himself, then to Bones, then to Agnes. But Agnes was no longer there, not truly. Her body still moved, yes, but her eyes were white and clouded, her mouth muttering nothing but circles, circles, circles. Her hands, skeletal and shaking, traced spirals on every surface she touched, on walls, on skin, in ash and blood. She no longer spoke to Sonnie or to Bram. She spoke to something deeper, something no one else could hear. And Bram, sensing opportunity, did what all tyrants eventually do: he demanded legacy. He announced a final act. A glorious ambush. Not of villagers or peasants, but of nobility. A wealthy family returning from pilgrimage, protected by guards, blessed by priests, riding in carriages trimmed with gold. Symbolic. Powerful. Delicious. We will break their bloodline, Bram declared to the clan, and the world will hear us chew. The plan was brutal in its precision. The beans waited in trees, hid beneath loose soil, watched from behind stones. When the caravan arrived, they struck like lightning, knives through throats, arrows dipped in rot. The horses reared and screamed as steel clanged against bone. Blood sprayed across the trees. Bodies were dragged into the undergrowth, limbs torn free. It was over in minutes. All dead, except one. One man, half alive, broken in spirit and body, crawled 3 days through mud and thorns, cradling something in his arms. When he reached the edge of a village, he collapsed, babbling, weeping, bleeding from wounds he couldn't feel. What he held was not a weapon. Not a relic. It was a child's severed arm, small, cold, with its fingers still curled like it had never stopped reaching for help. Cave, he whispered. Cave beneath the rock, they eat, they wear the faces of men. And just like that, the legend had a direction. A location. A face. And the crown, for the first time, understood that the nightmare was real, and it was already awake. The severed child's arm broke through more than just flesh and bone. It shattered illusion, pierced myth, and reached the throne itself. Word of the surviving nobleman's account reached Edinburgh within days, carried in hushed tones through candlelit halls and trembling hands. At first, King James VI laughed. A clan of cannibals in a sea cave. Madness. But then came the second report. And the third. And the fourth. All from different counties. All describing the same thing: disappearances, blood, spirals carved into stone, bones stripped clean. The laughter faded. Then came the order, swift, absolute, and unrelenting. This would not be another quiet inquiry. This was a purge. The king gathered a war host the likes of which had not been seen in generations: 400 men, mounted knights, season trackers, armed priests, bloodhounds bred to hunt men, mapmakers, surgeons, scribes, and executioners. And at the center of it all, riding beneath the royal banner, came the king himself. If hell had opened beneath his kingdom, he would ride into it with sword drawn. They moved south like a storm, lightning on hooves. Villagers pointed toward the cliffs with shaking fingers, refusing to go near. Not even the gulls land there, one farmer whispered. The expedition reached Benane Head just as the tide withdrew, exposing the inlet, a jagged crack in the cliff face, black as the grave. For 2 days they found nothing. The hounds grew restless. One attacked its own handler and had to be put down. Men muttered of curses and spirits. But on the 3rd day, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a single hound stopped. It sniffed the wind and let out a low, guttural growl, not at a man, but at the rock itself. Torches were lit. Swords drawn. They squeezed through the narrow opening, the air growing colder, heavier, thicker with each step. What they found inside would stain their memories for the rest of their lives. The stench came first, not of death, but of history rotting. Bones, endless bones, human, animal, infant, adult, stacked in patterns, carved into symbols, gnawed clean and arranged with the precision of architects. Flesh hung from hooks like drapes. Jars filled with teeth lined the walls. A child's doll made of knuckles sat propped on a pile of skulls. In one corner, a table set for a feast, untouched, as if guests were expected. Deeper still, they found a clan. Dozens of them. Naked, feral, eyes wide and useless from a lifetime in darkness. They hissed at the torchlight, snarled, lunged with sharpened teeth. Some attacked. Some bit. Some tried to dig back into the walls. But they were overwhelmed. Captured. Dragged into the open. And for the first time, the nightmare met daylight. Bram fought hardest. He killed 3 soldiers before they brought him down, slashed and screaming until the final blade pierced his chest. Sonnie was found slumped in a corner, gaunt and blood-stained, staring at the wall. When they seized him, he didn't resist. He looked the king in the eye and whispered, "We were hungry, and you forgot us." Agnes was already dead, curled beside a pile of bones shaped like a throne, her fingers still tracing an invisible spiral on the dirt floor. The rest of the clan, young and old, wide-eyed and shrieking, were hauled into the light. Many of them had never seen the sky. Some tried to claw their way back underground. One chewed off her own fingers. Another screamed until her throat tore. The villagers who had once whispered myths now watched in horror as the truth staggered through the fields. There was no trial. No mercy. No prayers. The king decreed immediate execution. The men were dismembered alive, each limb hung in the square as warning. The women and children were burned. The cave was sealed with iron and stone. Holy water was poured into the cracks. Crosses were nailed into the cliff face. But still, on stormy nights, locals swore they could hear the wind howling through the rocks, not like air, but like breath. Like laughter. Like something not quite dead, whispering that the hunger had only paused, not ended. The executions came fast, but the silence that followed came slower, heavier, like a fog that refused to lift. The bones were buried. The cave was sealed. The cliffs were marked with holy symbols and rusted chains. But no one celebrated. There were no cheers in the villages, no songs of triumph, no toasts in the taverns. Only stillness. As if the very land around Benane Head had inhaled in horror and forgot how to breathe. For weeks, maybe months, the villages surrounding the cliffs moved like ghosts. Shops opened late, closed early. Fields remained unplowed. Children stopped playing near the woods. Even the birds avoided the shoreline. The king returned to Edinburgh not as a hero, but as a man who had seen something that refused to let go. He had slain monsters, yes. He had burned their den and salted the earth. But as he rode past fields still empty from fear, past doors still locked in daylight, he began to understand the truth. Monsters don't rise from hell, they are grown. In silence. In poverty. In neglect. And it was that silence, more than any knife or curse, that had built the Bean clan. Scholars wrote of the event with horror. Chroniclers inked the tale into royal records. But between the lines, there was discomfort. How had a clan of cannibals thrived for 25 years undetected? How many children had vanished without anyone noticing? The truth was damning. People had looked away. Again and again. Easier to blame wolves. Easier to believe in demons. Easier to call it God's punishment than to admit the kingdom had simply not cared. Churches declared it divine retribution, a sign of what happens when man strays too far from God. But in hushed confessionals, some priests whispered darker truths. The Beans were not God's punishment. They were ours. The reflection of every orphan turned away. Every hungry child ignored. Every outcast abandoned to the wild. And what of the children, not just those born in the cave, but those above it? The ones who now feared every shadow. Who would never again walk near cliffs without flinching. Who dreamed of teeth in the dark. Some grew old and never spoke of what they had heard. Others passed the story down, but softened the details, changed the names, turned the screams into warnings, the bones into legend. But the fear remained, buried, not broken. Time passed. The world moved on. But the cave was still there. It always would be. And on some nights, when the waves hit the rocks just right, locals swore they could hear something, soft, distant, almost human. Not a voice. A presence. Like something remembering. Like something waiting. The king had sealed the cave with stone and scripture. But stone cracks. And memory, especially dark memory, does not die. It lingers in the soil. In the blood. In the stories whispered not around fires, but behind closed doors. And if you listen closely, past the wind, past the ocean, you might hear it too, the faint echo of something that was never fully destroyed. Just buried. And hunger, after all, never really sleeps. Years passed. Then decades. Then centuries. And like all horrors too terrible to stare at directly, the story of the Bean clan began to soften. The cave was given a name for tourists, Cannibal's Cove. A fence was erected. A plaque installed. The truth was sanitized, packaged, sold. The spiral of bones became a local curiosity. A grotesque fairy tale to frighten schoolchildren. But beneath the surface, where the wind still carried echoes through the cliffside, the silence had never healed. Archaeologists would one day study the sealed cavern, uncovering more bones than could be catalogued, some ancient, some disturbingly recent. One pile, tucked deep into a forgotten hollow, was too clean. Too untouched by time or salt or decay. The lead researcher left the field. Never spoke publicly again. Writers turned the legend into plays, novels, horror films. Some portrayed the Beans as supernatural beasts. Others as metaphors. But one author, long forgotten, wrote something that still lingers like rot beneath polished floorboards. If you want to see the Bean clan, look into any system that lets the forgotten rot unseen. The monster is not in a cave. It's in how we built the world above it. That line was never quoted on postcards. But it was the truest. Because in the end, the Bean clan wasn't just a family of cannibals. They were the consequence. The product. The mirror. And that mirror still stands. What makes a monster? Is it blood? Is it choice? Or is it the long, slow starvation of dignity, generation after generation, until all that remains is rage with teeth? Sonnie Bean didn't crawl out of the abyss. He was pushed. Shoved there by a world that had no place for the weak, no mercy for the hungry, no use for those who didn't fit. He didn't choose the darkness at first. He was born into the cold and learned to build a fire with bones. And when no one came looking, he learned to feed it. He chose evil, yes, but it was a learned language, taught by absence, spoken fluently in silence. There are stories, always stories, that one child escaped. That not all tunnels were sealed. That a midwife in a faraway village once delivered a baby with eyes too dark and teeth too sharp. But nothing was proven. And maybe that's the most dangerous part. Because once the legend became comfortable, it stopped being a warning. It became a ghost story. One that scared no one important. The cave still stands. Marked. Fenced. Watched. But the wind still moves through it. Not howling, but breathing. And if you listen too closely, it doesn't sound like memory. It sounds like waiting. Elders in nearby towns still refuse to speak of the cliffs. Some children still dream of being pulled underground. And on unmarked hillsides, some families still leave flowers, not out of forgiveness, but out of understanding. Because they know something allowed it to happen. Not magic. Not myth. Neglect. Policy. Cruelty hidden behind law. And that is why the story of the Bean clan still matters, not because of what they did in the dark, but because of what the world refused to do in the light. When we laugh off the past, we plant seeds. When we ignore the cracks in our walls, something always slips through. Rage grows fast in the dark. And it remembers how to crawl. So next time you see someone fall through the cracks, someone hungry, someone discarded, someone dismissed, ask yourself what kind of cave you're digging. Not with your hands, but with your choices. Because if history has taught us anything, it's this: evil doesn't always come roaring out of the abyss. Sometimes, it whispers. Sometimes, it waits. And sometimes, it's born exactly where no one bothers to look.